So here we have an example of using a float, right, to be able to create behaviors, to create columns, right, so that things render not only just vertically, but also horizontally, one next to the other. So let's look at an example, right, where we can use this technique to render things in a grid system. So we'd like to be able to do something like this, right, where we have contents that can render with various columns. This is a very common technique that publishers use in magazines and newspapers. It has been around for several centuries. It's a very well understood way to lay out lots and lots of content to break up the large content into smaller snippets of content, so that the human eye can easily consume this content. So it's been around since however long the publishing industry has been around, at least since the 1490s, and so today we are just reusing some of those same techniques, right, to create our own publishing on the web, right? But the web by default didn't allow us to create these kinds of layouts, right? But we want to be able to reuse some of those techniques. So let's see how we can create that, right? So let me grab that and create an example here. So let's create a directory where we can play around with a grid system. HTML. So let's load it here. So grid. So there we go. We have a grid system. It's nicely centered on the page, right? We have several columns. Here we have, let's see, we have 6 columns. Down below we have 4 columns. Here we have 2 columns. Okay, all taking up the same kind of width of the entire page, right? So to achieve this, we're using these styles, right? So let me remove that styles for a second, right? And let me re-render. Notice that if we remove the styling, right, it just behaves normally in a block policy, right, which is renders from top to bottom, from left to right, and it just adds vertical spacing to the content. So this is what would render normally, right? And this is what so from an HTML's point of view, this is the only thing that would be what we consider from an HTML's point of view, right? Somebody who's going to style this later would be responsible to add the CSS so that it renders correctly, right? So we would have 2 very well distinct responsibilities, right, for those that create the content and those that style that content, right? We just have to make sure that those that create the content, they apply the correct styling, right, that can then be styled by a designer, okay? So let's look at the styling here and how we can achieve this behavior, right? So there it is. Let me close everything else, close others. Let's make this a little bigger. So what we're doing here is that, first of all, we're grabbing and wrapping the entire content around with a class equal to container, okay? Which is very similar to what we did in Bootstrap, right? But this is not Bootstrap's container, right? This is our own. This is our own. And what we did here to add that is that we added a width, a well-known width that we can all agree is a perfect width for your particular device. We chose 600 pixels, and we added margin auto. Right? So margin auto is going to the combination of both providing a width, and providing margin auto allows us to center the content on the page. Right? Notice that it's indeed centered. Right? There are a couple other ways that we can center content, but this is a very common way to center content. You give it a particular width, right, and then you provide margin auto. meaning you're letting the browser decide what should the margins be for the remainder of the width of the entire page. Right? Notice that, and the browser decides to split the remaining width of the page amongst left and the right of the actual content. Right? And that's why you get that feature, that behavior of the content being centered. Okay? It's a very common technique for centering content. 600, I chose an arbitrary number, right? But typically you would have content that is for your specific device, right? Presumably for the particular width of your page, right? The bigger the page, perhaps this should grow, right? For smaller ones, it should be smaller, right? Depending on the device. I chose this arbitrary width just because it makes it easy for me to be able to divide it into various into 2s, into 3s, into various numbers, easily divisible. In particular, divisible by 2, 3, and 4. So that's what container does. Then notice that I have here a class called row, right? So basically what we're trying to do is recreate the same behavior that tables gave us back when we used to use tables. Yes? Tables were very convenient. Tables would break up the content into many rows and break it up into many columns. We want that, but we are not allowed to use tables. Okay? Right? But we want to recreate the same behaviors that tables afforded us. Right? So instead of using tables, we're going to use divs, right? Which divs are just generic rectangular portions, right? Rectangular elements. But we're going to style them. We're going to add these styles, right, to recreate the same behavior as tables. So first of all, we're going to say row. We're going to break up our content into several rows. So there's my first row that ends right here, and then then the second row ends here, and then a third row. And indeed, we have three rows, right? Here's our first row, our second row, and there's our third row. Yes? Then the content inside, we're going to also split it up into columns, right? We're going to have columns. So we have here 6 elements. They all have some style that starts with COL. Okay. Then we have, in the second row, we also have several columns. And down below, we have also, in the last row, we also have divs that have classes that start with column. See that? COL. Make sense? Right. But then so indeed they do behave like columns, right? We have one row that has 6 columns. And we have here another row, the second row has 4 columns. And here we have a row that has 2 columns. Make sense? But notice that we are adding an additional qualifier here, right? This name, the name for this class is actually not just column, right? It's column -2. Right? The -2 doesn't really mean anything, right? It's the whole name. It's column -2. Dash doesn't have any specific mathematical meaning or doesn't have any magical meaning. It's just that the name, the whole name, is column -2. Okay. I chose the name -2, right? Because we decided arbitrarily that our content was going to be divided into 12 equal parts. Okay, why 12? Well, it's a very common technique in the printing industry, right? That we're going to have a newspaper or a magazine, right? That the smallest size of a particular of a particular content, right? We're going to break it up into so many equal parts, right? That together are going to take up the entire width of the page, right? So I could decide to break it up into as many parts as I want. 100 parts, 50 parts, 1,000 parts, depending on how granular would I want to be. Yes? Right? And we could argue how many parts do I want to divide it by, but 12 is a very convenient number, right? It's a convenient number because it's divisible by many different values. It's divisible by 2, divisible by 3, divisible by 4, divisible by 6, right? It has many numerals that can be divided by, right? So you can split up the page into many different portions. You can divide it into, a column that takes up, 6 columns, and then the remaining 6 columns all, be, one column width. Okay, as long as all the columns add up to 12, right? So here I divided my first row. I divided it into 6 equal portions, all of the size 2, which add up times 6 add up to 12. That make sense? Right? And so then I strategically gave the width for these columns. I gave them strategically to be 100 pixels. See that? Which, if you add them up times 6, it adds up to 600 pixels. That makes sense? Right? So if I have 6 of these, each of 100 pixels, they add up to the total 600 pixels. Make sense? Right? Same thing with column -3. Right? We divided 6 divided by so this means that I'm gonna take up 3 of those 1 columns, right? And we're gonna all add up to be the total of 12. 3 times 4 is 12, right? So if I'm taking up 3 columns, that means that I would need 4 of these in total to add up to 12. Yes? Right? So altogether they add up to the whole width of the page. And at the last one we have 2 columns, right? Adding up to 12, column 6, meaning that each one needs to be 300 pixels wide. Yes? Right? And indeed column 6 is 300 pixels wide. Yes?
Is this method preferable over display flex at all? It seems like display flex.
Yeah, flex is starting to become more common. Yes, but most grid systems still follow this technique. Yep. So let's and you can combine these as you want, right? For instance, let's add another row. Let's add another row at the top. Right, you have a column on the left-hand side of equal size on each side. Notice that I added at the top. Notice I have 2 columns, and then you can combine them any which way you want. For instance, if I leave the column 6 on the left-hand side, right, I still have 6 columns to work on the right-hand side, right? Or I have 3 3 columns of width 2 to work with, right? So, for instance, I can have several of these. So 6 plus 2 times 3, that's another 6. That's 12 in total, right? So I would have in total, right? I guess that's way too large. Obviously, the content would have to change, right, to make it valid, right? But what I'm trying to point out is that I can combine, right, these in any which way I want. Make sense? Or instead, I could have another row here. Where you would have maybe 3s and 3. Oops, sorry. 3. Right, where you have 6 on one side and 2 columns of 3 on the right-hand side. So you can combine it any which way you want. That makes sense? Right. So this technique is exactly what Bootstrap and many other grid systems use, right, to create their own implementation of the grid system, right? So if you go to Bootstrap, you can take a look at their documentation for their own grid system. Right, you can read over it, and they do something similar, right? They have a container as an outer shell, and then inside they declare several columns, classes. Dot column, and then the different sizes, right? And they show here how they can be combined to either have single columns, or 8 and 4, or 3 equal parts of 4, or 2 equal parts of 6, right? You can split them up any which way you want. Make sense? Right? They go a little bit farther though, right? They go a little bit farther so that they can target different devices, right? So that as you resize your page, right? Perhaps it makes no sense that for smaller screens, it would make no sense to split something in half, right? It would just not fit. Right? So what do you do with that? Right? So we need to combine the technique of having a grid system, but also the technique of things wrapping. Right? We showed you earlier, right, of a floating system that as it became smaller and smaller and smaller, it flipped, right, so that it would wrap, so that if it didn't fit, things would become vertical, right? Would become vertical. So we need to extend this grid system to also be responsive. Notice that my grid system is not responsive, right? What I would like to be able to happen here is that if it doesn't fit, right, perhaps maybe don't use columns, right? Go back to behaving in your default way, right, of behaving just like a blocks elements, right? So that you take up the entire width of the page, right, and then things just wrap after that, right? So let's do that. Bootstrap allows you to do that by adding yet another level of specificity where you can target devices of different sizes. You can target large screens, you can target medium-sized screens, small screens, or extra small screens, right? That would target different phones, tablets, small monitors, or even larger monitors, right? And we'll look at that next.